1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 9 and verse 10. Paul is speaking here to the Corinthians, and he is trying to summarize the gospel to them. And he begins at the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. By the time he gets down to the 7th and 8th verse, he speaks about all the folk who saw Jesus when Jesus was resurrected from the dead. And in verse 8, he says, "And last of all, he was seen of me also, having already described the disciples having seen him, and hundreds others having seen him. He comes now and he says, last of all, he was seen of me also as one born out of due time. I did not appear that I should be able to see him. I got on the train late to see him. I caught on to the story late to see him. I was converted to what needed to be happened. The summary of the gospel did not come true to me until very late. And it seemed as if I almost missed the train. And then he validates the fact that he should come late. He's convinced that he's not worthy of even the news that he's been told of. Here's what John read for us, verse 9, "For I am the least of all the apostles, that I am not meet, I am not worthy, I ought not have the opportunity to be called an apostle. I'm lower than the rest of them. I remember what I did. I remembered when everybody thought I was doing good, that I was doing bad. I remember coming to church on Sabbath and the shiny clothes and the done hair and the nice shoes and the happy Sabbaths that I would extend. But nobody knew underneath the facade of all of that what was happening. For him specifically, he says, I didn't even like to go to church in the way that you did. I persecuted the church. For I am the least of the apostles, that I'm not meet to be called an apostle, because I remember what I did. I persecuted the church of God. I went against the grain of God's will. I fought against God himself. The people he was trying to save, the people he was trying to raise up, I resented them. I pushed against them. The people he called, I decided they weren't good enough. And I fought against what God was doing. I remember what I did. So when I think about who I was, I say I'm not worthy to be called by God. But then we have verse 10. It says, but by the grace of God, I am unworthy to be considered an apostle. I should never have been called. I did not meet the criteria, and I fought against the program and the agenda of the church. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. Paul's identity, Paul's purpose, Paul's drive, Paul's position in life, his influence, what he has, what he's able to do is not because he's great. He's counted himself lower than everybody else, but he says, whatever I am, whoever I am, even if other folk didn't choose me, by the grace of God, I am who God has made me. So he does not count himself having to measure up to everybody else's level of expectation. His measure of success is primarily, is wholly, is fully in the grace of God. I am not who I used to be because of the grace of God. I'm not who they would choose, but by the grace of God, I am who I am. And it is in this context of Paul understanding that his entire identification, his sense of purpose, his drive, that everything that he is made up entirely by the grace of God. It is in this context that I would like to study on primarily one verse for us today. This same Paul pens this verse. It comes to us in the letter that was written to the Romans and in the first division of that letter. I would turn your attention there to Romans chapter 1. You're just going one book backwards. Romans chapter 1. I'll give you some time to get there. Romans chapter 1. He, in the book of Romans, has an agenda. He knows who he's speaking to. The Romans are filled with a multicultural glob of people who have many different ideas about what to do and who to worship, and it's a mixture of cultures that have come together. And he knows the decadence that he speaks about pretty graphically in chapter 1, and he knows who he's speaking to, but he has an agenda for them throughout the entire letter that he writes to the Romans. Here's what he ends up saying to them. That all people are sinful people, but God's law exists for those people, that all have sinned and broken that law, and that the only way to salvation is through Jesus Christ. He wants to tell them about the promise of justification. He wants to tell them that they can be dead to sin but alive in Jesus Christ. He wants them to understand that they can be servants of God and they can be released from the law and the condemnation that comes from the law. He wants them to know that when you are with Christ, there's no condemnation for those that are with him who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. He wants to tell them that there's nothing at all in their world that separates them from the love of God. He wants them to know that they're God's chosen people, that is spiritual Israel. They can and shall be saved because of the blood of Jesus Christ. He wants them to know that since they're God's people, they've got to be changed from who they were to who they are supposed to be. And he wants to let them know not to be conformed to this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of their minds. He wants them to know, as he mentions at the tail end of his letter, that the God of peace shall bruise Satan's head under their feet. Not off in the future, but shortly. His letter is a letter that says to them, it doesn't matter who you are, what you did, where you went, how long you stayed there, and who you did it with, and how dark that place was, that you can be saved by the grace of God. And you see, he's not just speaking about something he doesn't know about. Paul, who views himself to be one who is saved by grace, who sees his identity and his purpose is bound up and measured by, created by, solidified by the grace of God. He's not just telling them a theory, he's telling them his testimony that indeed, I have been transformed. Indeed, I have been called. Indeed, I work for God. Indeed, just like me, you can be free from the bondage of sin because of the grace of God. I want, with one verse primarily here, to show you how Paul views what God has done in his life. Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. Verse 1. And here's what it says. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of God. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of Christ. Paul. Let's pause there at Paul for just a moment. Paul, his new name. He used to be Saul, you would remember. that he was met on the road, and God had enough, and Christ said, hey, this is me that you're fighting against. You can't win here. And he was converted, and he was transformed from Saul to Paul. And he had a new name, he had a new identity, that when folk called him to try and get his attention, what they called him now was not what they used to call him before. That old things are passed away, and behold, all things for Paul have become new. Paul is his new identity, given to him by God. Revelation tells us that when we make it to glory, that everyone who overcomes sin and makes it to glory, that of all the abundant riches that they will get, one of the things is you'll get a white stone with a name in it. It's your new name, and nobody else will know that name except for you and your God. Paul gets a mere faint shadow of this, that in fact, I can't wait to get to glory so I can get my new name, so I can hear him speak to me, and I know it's me that he's talking about. Paul gets that. And now instead of Saul, he's renamed Paul. He has a different purpose. When he wakes up in the morning, he's different. When he goes through the day, he's different. He desires God differently. By the grace of God, his identity has been changed. Paul. But the verse does not end at one word. It says, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ. You would remember that he says that he fought against Jesus Christ, that he fought against the church, that he did not believe that they were doing the right thing, that he thought he was following God even while he was fighting Jesus. Do you understand that Paul comes to the place where he now humbles himself to Jesus? That Jesus takes away his sight and then removes the scales after a number of days, and he gets a different purpose, and he's speaking to someone who's caring for him, who he hated. You can get to the place where the people God sent to take care of you are folk you deemed to be your enemies. God saves Paul, changes him by his abundant grace. And his name is changed, but his position is changed also. Now he's a servant of God. In fact, he speaks about the servitude. Look at the 6th chapter. Look at the 6th chapter of this letter of Romans. Chapter 6, and I turn your attention to the 17th verse. But in fact, I'll go to the 16th verse. Know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants ye are to whom ye obey? Don't you know that whichever person you're facing, if it's the devil, then you are a servant of the devil. But if it's the Lord, then you're a servant of the Lord. Don't you know that if you're obeying the devil, you're his servant and he counts you as such? Don't you know that even he had you in his servitude at one point, and even when you change your mind like Moses, he goes and fights and says, no, this is mine. And God has to fight back and said, no, no, no. He was converted. He changed. I'm taking his body. Don't you know that he claims you like he claimed Paul? But by the grace of God, just as Paul was converted and transformed, just as Paul was changed and renamed, you and I get to be changed and renamed too. And we will wake up in the morning and we turn our attention to God. And during the day, we turn our attention to God. And before we fall asleep, we turn our attention to God. That if we do these things, he gets to change us in such a way that we become followers of God, not just intellectual folk who understand intellectually who God is, but people who follow him, people who are moved by his teaching, moved by his direction, that now, instead of being a fighter against Christ, I am a follower of Christ. Now, it doesn't stop there. Paul, back to Romans chapter 1, verse 1, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ. But when you become a servant of Jesus Christ, he puts you to work. He says here, called to be an apostle. I just want to talk about this called portion for a moment. Called to be an apostle, chosen and invited by God himself. We are told in the Bible that, in fact, turn with me there, put a mark here at Romans, go with me to Matthew chapter 10. Let me read something amazing for you. Lest you think, like Paul, that you are unworthy and you can't make it into doing what God desires you to do, that somehow you're not useful, or let me remove that weight from your mind. Matthew chapter 10. I want to read for you Matthew chapter 10. It doesn't matter if you're a nurse, or if you're a doctor, or you're unemployed, or you're a garbage man, or you're a musician, or if you're a teacher, or if you're a student, or you ain't got no job at all. When you follow God and he changes your identity, he does not do it just so. He changes your identity, winds you up, points you in the right direction, enables you, empowers you, and gives you purpose. Matthew chapter 10, here's what it says. And when he had called unto him his 12 disciples, he gave them power against unclean spirits, to cast them out and to heal all manner of sickness and all manner of disease. Watch me now. Now the names of the 12 apostles are these. The first, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the publican, James, the son of Alphaeus, and Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent forth. We're told in the Gospels that Jesus prayed all night the night before. Ellen White tells us with more detail of the same story that Jesus went up into the Mount of Olives and he prayed all night for these disciples who were sleeping at the base of the mountain. While they were resting, he was praying above them. And in the morning, he calls them and he designates them his apostles. And he gives them power. But you and I have a problem with this list of folk, that we would not choose these folk. There's something wrong with these folk. They are argumentative, and they are political, and they are backbiting, and they're doubters. What I need you to understand, which Paul understood, is that God does not wait for you to be perfect before he calls you. God calls you as you are, knowing that what he's calling you to do will change you into who you're meant to be. You and I wait for folk to come to our standard, and then we say, now you can do it. But God says, no, I see your potential, so let me call you to do it. These folk were not the folk that you and I would choose, but these are the folk that God chose. I get it more personal. You not anybody that they would choose, but God chooses you anyway. And he does so without asking anybody else's permission. I want to read something for you. I want to read something from you. This comes from Desire of Ages. It is on page 296. This is Ellen White speaking about this this group that were chosen. The apostles differed widely in habits and disposition. There were the publican, Levi Matthew, and the fiery zealot, Simon, the uncompromising hater of the authority of Rome, the generous, impulsive Peter, and the mean-spirited Judas, Thomas, true-hearted, yet timid and fearful, Philip, slow of heart and inclined to doubt, and the ambitious, outspoken sons of Zebedee. These were brought together with their different faults, all inherited and cultivated tendencies to do evil. But in and through Christ, they were to dwell in the family of God, learning to become one in faith, in doctrine, in spirit. God chooses folk you would not. God chooses you when others won't choose you. God chooses you not because you have all of the prerequisites, but because you have all of the potential. God chooses you because it is his purpose to choose you. We'll come to the last line in this text where you'll see why God chooses you. He's up to something. If you've been asked to do something in the gospel of Christ and you are doubtful that you have the power to do it, I want you to know that your excuse that you give the rest of the folk around you that you don't have the experience and you don't know how to do it and you've never done it before and sister such and brother such and such, turn to them and ask them because I like when they do it. I'm telling you that when God chooses you, just as a humble servant and disciple, follow him. He will empower you to do far more than you think you can. Paul, changed from Saul, converted into a servant of Jesus Christ, was called, was invited, just as you and I are, to be an apostle of Christ. He was called. Others are called to be a pastor. Some are called to be teachers. Some are called to be organizers. Some are called to be compassionate supporters. There are a myriad set of gifts, but all are called. And if God calls you to do something that you've always done, I believe you're missing the boat. God always calls you to do more than you had done before. It's going to feel uncomfortable. It might feel unfamiliar. But when you walk with God, just consider what he's calling you to do right now. When you walk with God, he enables you and empowers you. How does he empower you? Is in the last line of this verse. Look at what it says. Let's go back to Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of God. I love the fact that this says gospel of God because we often in the gospels read in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that this is the gospel of Jesus Christ. This is the good news of Jesus Christ. But here now he's writing to the Romans after Christ has ascended, after Jesus has gone back to glory. So the story about Jesus becomes the good news of God. This is, he's called, he's separated now to deal with other people around the good news of God. And he's an apostle. He's been called to be an apostle, and an apostle is an ambassador. An apostle is one who brings the news. It's a messenger, one sent with miraculous power. He's not just sent with a letter without any authority. An apostle is authorized and empowered to bring the good news. And here we know the good news about God's Son, who by grace saves everybody. But this separation I want to mess around with before I bring this to a close. The definition of sanctification is separated, selected, individualized, called out, set apart for holy use. That of all the people that you know, of all the people in your family that are bright and intelligent and go-getters, of all the people that you know that are experienced, that all the people that you know that read the Bible well and study well and understand well, that of all those folk, that where you live, where you are, where by the grace of God he has placed you, God has called you to be the light for him there. That you don't have to preach like Paul, and you don't have to play like HL plays, and you don't have to be able to teach as intellectually as Sister Oneida does. You don't have to be able to do that. You just need to be called by God, and I don't have to be anybody else. I just have to be me, plain old Lance, saved by Jesus, covered by the blood. I just need to be me, and he calls me and does through me what he desires. And he does the same for you, that you are not good enough by men's standards. I'll prove it to you, but you're good enough by God's standards. Look at something real quick for me. Look at something. Let's go to 1 Corinthians. Let's go to 1 Corinthians. And go to chapter 1. I want to show you something. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And I invite you to go to the 26th verse. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 26. For ye see your calling, brethren, how in your calling that not many were wise men by human standards. And he has not called you because you're intellectually bright or somehow you've surpassed Isaac Newton. He has not called you because of your capability. He says not many, when they were called, were wise according to the standard of men, that not many were mighty, that not many were noble. These folk who were called, when you are called, you've not met man's standards, but you have been called to meet God's standard. That by the grace of God, you're the one that was called. But by the grace of God, you are who you are. Just like Paul says, I am what I am by the grace of God. But look at 27. But God had chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty, and the base things of the world which are despised hath God chosen. Yea, folk like you and me that nobody else would choose, God says, I'll take them. I've got something for them. I'm going to take those broken bricks and broken stones. I'll rebuild my entire church, my whole ministry with this. I will do it the way that I had Nehemiah use all of that old burnt stuff. God, when he takes the stubble and the broken and the burnt, he can make marvelous, divinely magnificent things, and you get to be a piece of that. You are something else. I need you to understand that when God looks at everybody else and he points you out, he says, you, come, let me show you. And when you say, no, Lord, I'm not good enough, he says in Isaiah 1:18, come, let's just talk about it. Let's reason it out. I know where you were, but I can fix all of that. I know what you've done. I can fix all of that. I know what they're saying, but when I get done with you, they won't be saying that. I'll give you a new name. I'll cover you with my grace. I can do it. I can fix it. But just come. And when you come to him, over time, he sanctifies you. And he removes the things that are unlike him from you. And he uses you in the way that he desires to. Not in the way that you plan, not in the way that they said, oh, this is perfect for you, but he uses you in the way he desires. And out of this, Paul then comes to this new sense of identity. That when he writes this sermon to the Romans, he wants them to know that when he talks to them about salvation and sanctification and redemption and the love of God and being transformed and renewed in your mind and overcoming, that he wants them to know, I've done that too. I am who I am by the grace of God. I, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated, sanctified, set apart for the gospel of God. When you read this one verse, I need you to remove Paul's name and put your name. It is I, Alec. It's I, Susan. It's I, Carla. It's I, Jennifer. It's I, Joyce. It's I, John, a servant of Jesus Christ, called by God to be his minister in his work, separated and sanctified for the ministry, the gospel of God. No matter where you sit, no matter what you've been asked to do, no matter your reputation, after they're done talking about you, after you've done listening, you go back in your closet and prayerfully consider that whatever God has called you to do, you are that solely, fully, by the grace of God. And you go out of that closet door with your head hung high and your chest out, knowing I am a servant of Jesus Christ by God's grace. I am transformed by God's grace. I have purpose by God's grace. And I am set apart by God for his ministry. You're that valuable, or he would not do it. Let's bow our heads briefly. Father in heaven, we turn to you now, grateful that you would look into the garbage pail of life and you would see fit to bring us out from the bottom of that darkness into your marvelous light. I ask now, Lord, for each heart that's represented here, that you may let them know who they are because of your grace, that you would remove their doubts, that you would remove all the things that are unlike you from them so that they may be bare and open to you and understand that they can only be valuable when they determine themselves to depend on you fully. We ask, Lord, for your grace to cover them so that they might accept who they are, called by you, changed by you, being used by you, even if nobody else would use them or choose them. I thank you for the new identity that you've placed at our feet. We desire, Father, to put on the robe of righteousness that your Son provides, so that even when you see us, you'll call us differently than you had called us before, from sinner to saved. We ask, Father, that you'd bless us fully now. Be with us the remainder of the Sabbath, we pray in your Son's name. Amen.